You may not expect a marriage to begin with fear, but in Tudor England, it often did. Behind the closed doors of those grand chambers, silence carried more power than affection, and every glance held the weight of consequence. Lives shifted in rooms meant for rest, shaped by rules older than the couples themselves. Tonight, you will walk into that world and see how a bedroom became a battlefield. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If one stepped quietly into a Tudor household, the first surprise would be how little the private world actually belonged to those who lived inside it. The bedchamber, which modern eyes might imagine as a retreat, was nothing of the sort. It carried the weight of expectation, surveillance, and obligation, as if the walls themselves had learned to listen. The space held more than a bed and a hearth. It held the unspoken rules of rank and the silent pressure of being watched. Even before a marriage was tested by affection or disappointment, the room announced its purpose. It was not for comfort but for scrutiny. Servants moved in and out of the chamber, with the ease of people who had long accepted that privacy was a luxury reserved for no one. Their presence was constant, predictable, and woven into the rhythm of the household. A woman tying the laces of her gown might feel eyes behind her. A man resting after a long evening might notice the door open just enough for someone to observe him. It was considered normal, a simple expectation of Tudor society, that the most intimate corners of life were never truly one's own. Those same servants, meant to clean or dress, often carried other roles that were rarely spoken aloud. Some were placed strategically by powerful families, their real purpose not to serve, but to record. They watched gestures, noted tones, and remembered every detail that could later be repeated in a different room, to a different master, with consequences no one inside the chamber could predict. A careless expression or a moment of hesitation might become evidence in the wrong hands. Even silence had a way of being interpreted. The fear of being misread added a quiet tension to daily routines. Husbands and wives carried themselves carefully, knowing that any sign of disagreement could be described as disloyalty or weakness. A raised eyebrow might seem trivial, yet in these tightly woven households, it could become the spark for a rumor strong enough to shift alliances. The chamber was never neutral ground. It absorbed and reflected the tensions of the court, amplifying them in subtle ways. For many women, the lack of privacy in the bedroom became a constant source of discomfort. Every movement, sitting, standing, adjusting clothing, was witnessed and remembered. Their bodies were meant to symbolize virtue, obedience, and fertility. And so the bedroom became a stage where these expectations were rehearsed daily. The idea of having a personal moment, free from judgment, was almost impossible. The room that should have sheltered them became a place that defined their reputations. Men, too, were aware of the watching eyes. Their authority could be questioned if they appeared too gentle, too indulgent, or too distant. The performance of dominance and control became a quiet ritual enacted within those walls. A man who failed to display expected strength risked whispers about his competence, not only as a husband, but as a figure of household power. The bedroom was not only about intimacy, it was about sustaining an image that others demanded of him. In wealthier households, the presence of attendants multiplied. Some slept only a few steps away from the marital bed, claiming the necessity of tending the fire or being available at dawn. Their nearness blurred the boundaries between public life and private life. The couple inhabiting the center of the household became the least protected from observation. Every door that opened, every footstep, every shadow moving across the wall reminded them that nothing they did existed only between the two of them. The practice of reporting behaviour was so embedded in Tudor culture that few questioned its morality. Information was currency, and the bedroom was one of the richest sources. A servant might whisper an observation to another household member, who might pass it upward until it reached someone with the power to change a life. Entire relationships could shift because of something as small as a sigh or a moment of hesitation during conversation. The intimate became political, without anyone naming the transformation. Children growing up in these homes learned early that privacy was not an expectation, but a rarity. They observed their parents' careful behavior, their measured tones, their controlled expressions. The lesson became clear long before adulthood. In a world watched from all angles, survival required caution. The bedchamber offered neither warmth nor refuge. It offered only another stage where one must behave according to expectation. Even the objects within the room reflected this reality. Heavy curtains, meant to keep out cold air, also kept in voices. Carved bed frames stood as symbols of lineage, wealth, and duty, reminding those who slept within them that they were never separate from the household's demands. A misplaced garment or an unguarded letter could become a source of speculation. The very furniture participated in the scrutiny, holding secrets that might one day be uncovered. To modern sensibilities, the absence of privacy in the most intimate space seems almost unbearable. Yet to the people who lived it, the system was so ingrained that many no longer recognized it as an intrusion. It was simply the way of life, a constant awareness that someone might be listening, watching, or waiting to interpret. The boundary between self and society dissolved within these walls, leaving individuals exposed in ways that shaped their marriages, their reputations, and their futures. The illusion of control within the bedchamber was fragile. A spouse could pretend to command the room, yet every gesture could be undone by a whispered report from a servant. Authority meant little when observation was constant. Even the most powerful inhabitants understood that the bedroom, despite appearing personal, belonged to the household rather than to them. Those who tried to seek moments of quiet found themselves unsettled by the feeling that silence did not guarantee safety. The absence of sound often meant that someone was paying closer attention, not less. People learned to monitor their own expressions, adjust their posture, choose their words with care, and rehearse emotions they did not feel. The chamber shaped behavior as much as any law or expectation outside it. When one understands how deeply these practices penetrated the household, the idea of intimacy becomes almost impossible to imagine. What unfolded in the bedroom was less about affection and more about performance, reputation, and duty. Those who lived in Tudor marriages carried this weight every night, knowing that the bedchamber was not a sanctuary, but a stage illuminated by unseen eyes. What lingered in that room's quiet corners still pressed against the lives inside it. The space drifted toward a deeper tension that none of them could escape, and something waiting beyond that silence would reveal just how tightly power held their private world. Marriage in Tudor England rarely began with affection. It began with calculation, quiet, deliberate, and deeply rooted in the needs of families who measured their future in land, lineage, and alliances. A union between two people was never simply about companionship. It was a binding agreement that shaped inheritance, strengthened political positions, and preserved bloodlines that mattered far more than personal preference. The moment two families considered a match, the couple ceased to be individuals. They became pieces in a larger design, arranged with care to secure advantage. Most brides and grooms entered marriage knowing that their wishes held little weight. Each carried the expectations of their households, and these expectations overshadowed any private feelings they might have had. The ceremony might appear celebratory to those watching, but beneath the surface lay an understanding that the two people standing together were already tethered to duties they had not chosen. The exchange of promises was as much a public declaration of alliance as it was a personal vow. Every witness understood the stakes. A woman was often valued for her dowry, her family's reputation, and her potential to produce heirs. Her character or desires were secondary. Her role was predetermined long before she walked into the marriage chamber. She was expected to secure her husband's lineage, maintain his household, and reinforce the connection between the two families. Her life narrowed into these expectations from the moment negotiations began. She became a vessel for continuity, an investment meant to yield stability. Men, in turn, entered marriage with responsibilities that were equally shaped by external pressure. A husband was expected to control land, protect alliances, and ensure the production of heirs who could carry the family's name forward. His authority was reinforced not just by social norms, but by law, which granted him power over his wife's body, property, and choices. He was a figurehead of household strength, judged by his ability to manage both domestic and political obligations. Failure to meet these expectations brought shame that extended beyond his private life. The process that led to marriage was itself a display of negotiation. Families debated terms with a level of formality that resembled business arrangements. Land might be transferred, debts resolved, and loyalties secured. These discussions could stretch for months, involving priests, lawyers, and relatives who sought to protect their interests. In such a system, affection had no space. The bride and groom might barely speak before the wedding, yet they were expected to uphold a union that symbolized the merging of two lineages. Once married, the couple's lives became intertwined with the shifting web of Tudor politics. A husband's rising or falling fortune affected his wife's standing and her behavior. In turn, influenced his reputation. Each became a reflection of the other in a society where perception carried real consequences. Their unity served as a public performance of stability, even when their private feelings diverged. They were bound tightly, not only by vows, but by the watchful eyes of relatives, servants, and rivals. The marriage bed, which modern sensibilities often associate with intimacy, played a critical role in confirming the alliance. Witnesses might be present at the bedding ceremony to ensure legitimacy and verify that the union had begun properly. This intrusion was not considered unusual. It reinforced the idea that marriage served the community, not the individuals. Personal comfort was secondary to the assurance that the union could produce heirs. The couple's bodies became part of the contract, subject to scrutiny and expectation. Children born from the marriage strengthened the agreement, tying families together through blood. But the absence of children, or the absence of sons, destabilized everything. A wife might find her position weakened, while a husband faced pressure to secure his lineage through other means. The marriage, once celebrated, could become a symbol of failure. In such moments, affection mattered even less. Practical concerns over succession, inheritance, and alliances overshadowed every emotional layer. For many couples, daily life became an act of compliance. They learned to operate within the roles assigned to them, adjusting their behavior to match what society demanded. Some found a measure of companionship, while others drifted into silent endurance. The structure of the marriage left little room for personal expression. Each partner lived within the confines of a contract that shaped their identity more than any private feeling. Families watching from the outside rarely concerned themselves with the emotional health of the marriage. They looked for signs that the union fulfilled its intended purpose: stability, advantage, and continuation of lineage. As long as these outcomes were met, the internal dynamics of the couple were considered irrelevant. Their private struggles dissolved beneath the weight of political necessity. Even when affection grew between spouses, it existed within a framework that limited its expression. Love, if it appeared, I had to coexist with the demands of duty. A couple might share moments of warmth, yet they remained conscious of the obligations that surrounded them. Their bond, however genuine, existed in the shadow of expectations that never loosened their grip. Over time, the idea that marriage might serve personal happiness became almost inconceivable. The system taught generations to accept alliance over emotion and to treat marriage as a mechanism of survival. This acceptance shaped the culture of the era, leaving behind a legacy that cast long shadows over the lives caught within it. What tied these unions together was never sentiment, but the weight of obligations that shaped every decision. The quiet pressure of expectation pushed each household into deeper entanglements that few could avoid. And within that tightening structure lay a truth waiting to surface, one that would expose how easily power could slip into the most private spaces. Authority within a Tudor marriage was most clearly revealed once the couple crossed the threshold of the bedchamber. The law granted the husband control over his wife's body, and this control was not symbolic. It shaped the rhythm of their nights, determined the meaning of consent, and defined the boundaries of defiance. The man stood at the center of this structure, protected by custom and reinforced by the expectations of every household watching quietly from outside the door. In this setting, the room became less a place of intimacy and more a place where dominance was quietly rehearsed each evening. A wife who hesitated or resisted could be judged as disobedient. Her refusal was not interpreted as the expression of an individual, but as a challenge to the order her husband was expected to maintain. The consequences of such resistance varied, but none favored her. She might be scolded, punished, or reported for failing to uphold her marital duties. Even silence could be noted as reluctance, and reluctance itself could become evidence of weakness or defiance. Her body was not seen as something she owned. Rather, it was viewed as a resource to secure lineage and reflect the husband's authority. The man, meanwhile, was expected to assert this authority with a certainty that left little room for hesitation. His behavior in the bedroom was considered an indicator of his overall strength. If he appeared too passive, too lenient, or too gentle, whispers could begin among servants and relatives. Those whispers might travel farther than he imagined, shaping opinions about his capability to manage the household. The pressure to display control turned the chamber into a stage where he performed a role written long before his birth. These expectations carried an emotional weight that neither spouse could ignore. The husband's duty was to maintain the structure handed down to him, while the wife bore the burden of complying with it. Attempts to soften the imbalance rarely lasted. The larger system pressed against the couple like a steady hand, reminding them that the marriage existed within rules far older than their personal desires. Even moments of kindness were filtered through this understanding, as if tenderness required permission. In the privacy that never truly existed, small gestures took on sharp meaning. A husband stepping closer might signal affection, or it might remind the wife of obligations she could not refuse. A pause in conversation could feel like a warning. Every movement within the room carried layers of expectation, shaped by the knowledge that the husband's word held final authority. The imbalance settled into their nightly routines, turning natural vulnerability into something governed by fear rather than trust. Some men exercised this power with a quiet sense of entitlement, convinced that their position justified any demand. Others carried out their role with discomfort, but still upheld the rules, because the consequences of breaking them were unthinkable. A man who lost control of his household risked ridicule or scrutiny that could shake his standing in the community, even if he wished to offer his wife more freedom. The structure surrounding them allowed little space for deviation. The system relied on conformity, and conformity sustained its strength. For women, the chamber became a place where their autonomy vanished the moment the door closed. Their consent was assumed, not requested. Their silence was interpreted as agreement, regardless of their feelings. Many learned to submit quietly, not because they accepted the arrangement, but because resistance would only deepen their vulnerability. This silent endurance became a survival strategy passed from one generation to the next, shaping the expectations of daughters long before they married. The repetition of these dynamics left traces on both spouses. The husband, shaped by the weight of authority, learned to see dominance as duty. The wife, shaped by the weight of compliance, learned to erase parts of herself in order to avoid conflict. Their shared life was built on these unequal foundations, held together not by mutual choice, but by the demands of a culture that believed stability required hierarchy. Even the physical space echoed this imbalance. The large bed, heavy curtains, and dim light created an atmosphere that blurred the lines between intimacy and obligation. The quiet of the room amplified the tension, making every decision feel more final. The air held the unspoken truth that whatever occurred inside the chamber was beyond question, because the husband's authority was protected by both custom and law. Some couples managed to carve out moments of tenderness within this structure, but such moments were brief and fragile. The system did not collapse simply because two individuals wished for a different kind of relationship. The rules remained unchanged, pressing against them like the weight of generations that demanded obedience above all else. Personal desire could not undo what had been codified into the expectations of an entire society. In this environment, power lingered in every shadow of the chamber. It shifted subtly, sometimes expressed in quiet commands, sometimes in gestures that carried unspoken warnings. A wife could do little but adapt to its presence, while a husband learned to wield it whether he wanted to or not. The room absorbed these tensions, making them part of the nightly routine until neither spouse could remember a time when the imbalance had not existed. What settled over their nights was less affection than a quiet enforcement of roles neither had chosen. The chamber tightened around them with each unspoken demand, narrowing the space where comfort might have lived. Something waiting in that narrowing silence would soon press even harder against the life of the wife. The wedding night in Tudor England was never a private moment shaped by affection. It unfolded instead under the weight of traditions that had little to do with tenderness and everything to do with obligation. The couple who entered the room did so with the knowledge that their union had already been witnessed, judged, and documented by others long before the door closed behind them. Whatever they might have hoped for, warmth, trust, or even curiosity, was overshadowed by the understanding that their bodies now served a purpose beyond their own desires. The atmosphere in the chamber carried this expectation like a second presence. For the bride, the night often arrived with a sense of resignation. She understood that her consent, in the modern sense, mattered very little. The moment she agreed to the marriage, her body became part of a larger design meant to secure lineage and alliances. What happened between her and her husband would be interpreted not as a personal interaction, but as the fulfillment of a societal requirement. Her hesitation, if she felt it, remained hidden beneath layers of duty. The chamber allowed no room for doubt. The groom, too, carried his own burden of expectation. He was not simply entering the room as a husband, but as a representative of his family's interests. His performance was tied to his reputation. He was expected to consummate the marriage promptly and confidently. A failure to do so could spark rumors that reached beyond the household, questioning his strength, his virility, or even the legitimacy of the marriage itself. Such doubts had the power to weaken alliances. The wedding night was therefore not a moment of discovery. It was a task. Servants and attendants often lingered just outside the door, waiting for confirmation that the union had been completed. Their presence, though silent, shaped the atmosphere of the room. The couple understood that their actions might be inspected or even reported. In some households, the sheets were checked the following morning as proof of consummation. The intrusion of others into such a personal moment was normalized, leaving the bride and groom with little sense of true privacy. The chamber became an extension of the court, where expectations replaced intimacy. The act itself carried emotional consequences that neither spouse could fully avoid. The bride might feel fear or discomfort, yet she had no space to express it freely. Her duty was to comply, to ensure that the marriage could not be questioned. The groom, under pressure to display authority. You might rush through the moment or approach it with a level of detachment required by the expectations placed on him. Their first night together became a ritual of power rather than a shared experience. Even when the couple held some affection for each other, the structure surrounding the night left little room for natural connection. Their bodies were assigned roles before their emotions had a chance to form. The performance of duty overshadowed whatever tenderness might have existed. The wedding night did not promise closeness. It introduced the imbalance that would follow them through their marriage. Power entered the room before either of them touched the bed. In the years that followed, the memory of that night often lingered in ways neither could fully articulate. For the bride, it marked the moment she stepped into a life shaped by expectations she did not choose. For the groom, it cemented the understanding that his authority was not personal, but inherited. Enforced by custom rather than affection, the ritual set the tone for their married life. Where the repetition of duty overshadowed the possibility of comfort, the chamber itself seemed to absorb the emotions of the night. Heavy curtains, dim candles, and the weight of silence contributed to an atmosphere that made the ritual feel almost predetermined. The environment encouraged obedience, not connection. It reminded the couple that marriage was a contract first and a relationship only if circumstances allowed. The bed, meant to symbolize union, instead became a symbol of obligation. By dawn, whatever had occurred during the night became part of the household's unspoken record. The bride and groom emerged not as partners discovering each other, but as figures fulfilling roles that had long been assigned to them. The power dynamic, established in that first moment, often remained in place for the rest of their lives, shaping everything that followed. What began in that dimly lit chamber settled over the marriage like a quiet command. The weight of obligation pushed aside any hope for gentler beginnings. What waited beneath that uneasy silence would soon reveal how deeply power overshadowed every corner of their private world. Virginity in Tudor England carried a weight that reached far beyond the body of the bride. It was treated as a measure of worth, a certificate of purity that determined the strength of a marriage agreement and the honor of two families. The wedding night did not simply confirm intimacy, it testified to lineage, legitimacy, and reputation. A young woman entered marriage, knowing that the expectations placed upon her were not abstract ideals, but demands that shaped her entire future. Her value was bound to a single moment she could neither control nor reclaim. From the instant she stepped into the chamber, she carried the quiet knowledge that her body would be examined through implication, rumor, or physical proof. What should have been a private memory instead became an event interpreted by others. A stained sheet could secure alliances, reinforce loyalty, and silence doubt. An unstained sheet, or even the suspicion of one, could turn admiration into hostility. The room itself became an informal courtroom, where judgment lingered in the air before dawn arrived. The danger of being questioned hovered constantly. A wife whose virginity was doubted stepped into a world where suspicion grew quickly, and forgiveness appeared rarely. Relatives might whisper, servants might speculate, and husbands might interpret the smallest hesitation as evidence of a concealed past. In such an environment, fear settled into her posture, her voice, and her breathing. The thread that held her reputation together was so thin that a single rumor could tear through it. For many women, the dread of accusation shaped their behavior more sharply than the marriage vows themselves. A groom, even one with a limited understanding of his wife's experiences, understood how these expectations reflected upon him. If he believed the marriage had not been consummated properly, he risked humiliation among relatives and peers. His doubts could become accusations. His accusations could become statements of fact, and those statements could unravel the agreement between families. A bride's honor was therefore tied inseparably to his confidence. The imbalance made every gesture on the wedding night carry consequences far beyond emotion. The intrusion of outsiders into what should have been a private ritual intensified the pressure. Servants who checked linens, neighbors who speculated on the couple's behavior, and relatives who expected immediate proof all contributed to the atmosphere of scrutiny. Even silence became suspicious. A quiet room could be interpreted as hesitation, reluctance, or failure. The couple learned early that their lives were not their own. Their bodies existed within a network of expectations shaped by others. For the wife, the chamber did not feel like a sanctuary. It resembled a place where she might be examined without ever being touched, where her future depended on perceptions rather than truth. She could not defend herself easily against accusations, because innocence required proof she might not be able to provide. The fragility of her position turned the room into a landscape of tension, where she walked carefully, spoke carefully, and existed within boundaries imposed by fear rather than desire. Over time, this fear is settled into daily life. A woman who sensed her husband's doubt learned to anticipate questions before they were spoken. She adjusted her behavior, softened her tone, and rehearsed responses that might calm him. Her emotional world narrowed into the effort of maintaining his confidence. The anxieties of one night cast a long shadow over the marriage, turning intimacy into a negotiated peace that could be disrupted by the slightest ripple. The chamber, once again, played an unforgiving role. It held memories the couple did not speak of, reminders of a threshold crossed under pressure rather than trust. Every time they returned to the bed, traces of that first night lingered, shaping expectations and reinforcing the imbalance between them. The room became an archive of judgment, storing fears that might resurface without warning. What made the situation more precarious was the broader society's willingness to accept suspicion as truth. A woman accused of lacking virtue faced consequences that extended beyond her marriage. She could become isolated within her household, shamed by relatives, or dismissed as unworthy in social gatherings. Her identity became defined by a moment she did not control, a moment that others claimed the right to interpret. The cruelty of such judgment was softened by tradition, as if the weight placed upon her were natural rather than constructed. In the end, virginity acted less as a personal trait and more as a mechanism of control. It reinforced power structures, maintained alliances, and ensured that the wife entered marriage from a position of vulnerability. Her worth was tied to proof, her safety tied to perception, and her future tied to her husband's belief. The quiet harm of this system lingered beneath every marriage that began under its rules. The tension born in that charged silence became a fragile bond shaped more by scrutiny than trust. The chamber continued to press its expectations onto her life, tightening the world she moved through. A deeper strain beneath that tightening space would expose how sharply danger and judgment shaped her every breath. In Tudor households, the expectation to produce a son settled over a marriage long before the couple understood how deeply it would shape their lives. The need for an heir was not a simple wish, but a public requirement, one that defined the stability of families, the transfer of land, and the continuation of lineage. From the moment a bride entered her new home, she carried the quiet burden of knowing that her value would be measured by her womb. Every gesture of kindness toward her, every polite smile, contained an undercurrent of calculation. Could she secure the future they demanded? The first months of marriage were filled with watching. Relatives monitored her health, servants observed her appetite, and neighbors speculated about her appearance. A missed cycle might spark anticipation, a normal one brought disappointment. Even before a pregnancy was confirmed, whispers circulated through the household like a draft slipping beneath a door. Her body became a site of constant assessment, as if every movement hinted at success or failure. She was expected to welcome this attention without complaint, for silence was seen as a sign of acceptance. When a child was finally conceived, the scrutiny intensified. Every symptom was interpreted as an omen. A craving might be celebrated. A moment of fatigue might be questioned. And any hint of discomfort was met with warnings disguised as advice. She learned quickly that her own experience of pregnancy mattered less than the expectations surrounding it. Her role was to endure, not to express. The husband, though sometimes anxious or hopeful, viewed the process through the lens of inheritance. His concern revolved around the continuation of his name, not the toll the journey took on her. But the outcome of childbirth rarely matched the hopes placed upon it. A daughter, though precious to the mother, could be received with frustration or polite disappointment by the household. The wife might feel affection for her newborn, yet she understood the unspoken truth. The pressure had not lessened. It had shifted. She would be expected to try again, and perhaps again, until the result aligned with what society demanded. Each daughter born became another reminder of the expectations she had not fulfilled. A miscarriage brought even sharper consequences. Instead of sympathy, she might encounter suspicion or blame. Some questioned her constitution, others hinted at divine displeasure. The husband could grow distant, not always out of cruelty, but out of fear that the marriage would not produce what he needed. The loss, already heavy, became a marker against her, weakening her position within the household. A wife who miscarried more than once might be spoken of as fragile, unlucky, or unfit. These judgments followed her like shadows. The fear of being replaced grew slowly, tightening around her mind with each failed attempt. History had shown that husbands could look elsewhere for heirs, or seek annulments that left wives abandoned and disgraced. Even if such outcomes were rare, the possibility remained present enough to unsettle her daily life. The wife learned to measure every interaction with her husband through the lens of expectation. A glance that lingered too long, a sigh that escaped him, or a shift in tone all became signals she tried to decipher, hoping to understand whether her position had begun to erode. This fear fostered a quiet form of jealousy, not rooted in affection but in survival. She understood that another woman, whether a mistress, a relative, or even a hypothetical future wife, could take the place she had worked so hard to secure. The pressure to produce a son became intertwined with the fear of losing everything else: her home, her status, and her identity. In this atmosphere, jealousy was not an emotional flaw, but a natural reaction to a system designed to make women replaceable. Her husband, too, felt the strain. His reputation and security depended heavily on the arrival of a male heir. Friends might whisper suggestions, relatives might apply subtle pressure, and advisors might question the stability of his marriage. These influences hardened his expectations. Even if he cared for his wife, the fear of leaving his estate vulnerable pushed him to evaluate her through the narrow lens of fertility. The chamber, once a place of obligation, became a quiet battlefield of unspoken anxieties. As months turned into years, the wife's daily life narrowed into cycles of hope and dread. She struggled to maintain composure in a world that interpreted every breath she took. The household silence after each birth spoke as loudly as any accusation. With each disappointment, her sense of self thinned. She existed in the tension between who she was and what others demanded her body must provide. The pressure that settled over her life created a bond shaped more by fear than certainty. The household tightened its expectations with each passing year, leaving little room for comfort. The unease growing beneath that narrowing world would soon reveal how jealousy and control would take root inside the chamber. Jealousy in a Tudor marriage rarely grew from affection. It emerged instead from the quiet fear of losing power, position, or stability. Fears that slipped into the chamber long before love ever had a chance to settle. The husband and wife lived under a system that measured their worth by the roles they fulfilled. and any threat to those roles carried consequences that touched every part of their lives. Jealousy became a natural symptom of a world where intimacy was overshadowed by expectation, and where even small gestures could shift the balance of a household. For the wife, jealousy began as a whisper rather than a sharp emotion. She understood the fragility of her place. Her position depended not on affection, but on her ability to meet the demands of marriage, producing heirs, maintaining composure, and honoring her husband's authority. Any failure in these duties made her vulnerable. If a servant lingered too long near her husband, if a visiting relative held his attention, or if a rumor drifted through the household, she felt the ground beneath her tighten. The fear was not simply that she might lose her husband's regard, but that she might lose the little security she possessed. This quiet fear shaped her movements within the chamber. She watched her husband carefully, reading his tone, his pose, the way he carried himself after speaking to others. His silence could feel heavier than his words. A distant expression might signal frustration, disappointment, or suspicion. The wife learned to interpret these signs with precision, for her safety depended on understanding them. Each night, she entered the bedroom, aware that she was being measured by standards she could not control. The husband, too, felt jealousy, but of a different nature. His concerns focused less on affection and more on honor. A wife who appeared inattentive, withdrawn, or too comfortable in the presence of another man posed a threat to his standing. In a society where rumors traveled faster than truth, even the suggestion of impropriety could undermine his authority. He worried not only about her fidelity, but about how others perceived it. The slightest hint of doubt could cast him as weak, unable to control his household, or unworthy of respect. These fears seeped into the chamber in ways that neither spouse wished to acknowledge. A wife who avoided conversation might be accused of hiding something. A husband whose temper shortened might be acting from insecurity. They moved around each other with a delicate caution, aware that any misstep could provoke questions. The pressure of maintaining an image of unity, even when unity felt impossible, pressed heavily against their interactions. The bedroom, meant to be a refuge from the outside world, became instead a place where each wondered what the other thought, but dared not say. Servants played an unspoken role in this tension. Their presence, though quiet, influenced the couple's behavior. They noticed shifts in tone, recorded changes in mood, and whispered findings to others within the household. Their observations shaped how jealousy evolved. A misplaced comment, a raised eyebrow, or a shadow crossing the hall at the wrong time could become the seed from which suspicion grew. Neither husband nor wife could fully ignore the possibility that someone was watching, listening, or interpreting. As jealousy took root, nights became more fragile. The husband might ask questions that felt too pointed or linger on topics that unsettled the wife. She, in turn, might adjust her posture or voice to appear calm, even when unease pulsed beneath her skin. Their attempts to hide their fears only deepened the distance between them. The chamber absorbed these tensions, storing them like layers of dust that thickened over time. The room that witnessed their most private moments also became the silent keeper of their doubts. Jealousy shifted the emotional landscape of the marriage. It replaced moments of quiet connection with calculation. Each spouse measured the other's reactions, as if determining whether the foundation beneath them had begun to fracture. The wife wondered whether another woman might be waiting to assume her place. The husband wondered whether he had overlooked signs of disloyalty. Neither dared to speak openly, for honesty risked igniting conflicts that could not be contained. Over time, jealousy became part of the chamber's atmosphere. It lingered between conversations, settled into pauses, and shaped the way the couple lay beside each other. Even when the marriage appeared stable, the tension remained. It followed them into their daily routines, influencing decisions made outside the chamber while growing quietly within it. Jealousy did not always erupt into confrontation. More often, it remained hidden, a constant presence that darkened the relationship from within. The deeper truth was that jealousy thrived in a world built on hierarchy rather than trust. When a marriage depended more on duty than companionship, every shift in attention felt significant. The wife feared replacement, the husband feared humiliation. Both were trapped in a system that encouraged suspicion and punished vulnerability. The bedroom, where they might have found understanding, instead amplified their fears until neither felt entirely safe. The strain woven into their nights had less to do with desire than with the fragile roles they fought to protect. The chamber tightened its hold on them with each unspoken worry, turning silence into suspicion. Rising tension beneath that silence would soon uncover how restraint and secrecy shaped the rest of their married lives. Jealousy in a Tudor marriage did not depend on affection. It grew instead from the quiet fear that power could slip away without warning, carried off by someone with stronger influence, better fortune, or a lineage more useful to the household. In this world, possession mattered more than emotion, and a spouse's value was often measured by the security they provided rather than the comfort they offered. The chamber, meant to shelter them from the demands of the court, became the place where these fears crept most easily into the mind. For the wife, the fear of being replaced hovered constantly. She understood that her worth to the household rested on her ability to produce heirs, maintain composure, and uphold her husband's reputation. If another woman appeared more suitable, whether a distant cousin, a widow with connections, or even a quiet servant whose presence lingered too long, the threat became real. The wife's jealousy was not born of longing, but of survival. She sensed how quickly her position could be weakened by whispers she never heard and gestures she never witnessed. In such an atmosphere, she learned to observe her surroundings with deliberate care. Her husband's movements became signals she tried to decipher. If he returned home later than usual, if his tone shifted, if his eyes drifted elsewhere, she felt the tension rise. These small changes fed her anxiety, not because she feared his affection drifting, but because she feared that her place in the household might fracture. The pressure to preserve her position made her sensitive to every moment of distance. Jealousy settled into her daily life as quietly as dust along the edges of the chamber. For the husband, jealousy took a different shape. His concerns centered not on losing affection, but on losing honor. A wife who appeared distracted, withdrawn, or too familiar with another man could jeopardize his reputation, even if she remained loyal. The perception of impropriety was enough to cause damage. A husband feared mockery from rivals, questions from relatives, and suspicion from the court. In a world where pride shaped identity, jealousy became a defensive response to protect his standing. His watchfulness over his wife existed not purely from emotion, but from the pressure to maintain authority. These parallel fears created a delicate tension between them. They moved cautiously within the chamber, measuring each other's expressions and silences. A wife might hold herself a little more rigidly, fearing that softness would be interpreted as guilt. A husband might speak more sharply, believing that firmness preserved control. Their efforts to guard themselves from insecurity only deepened the distance between them. Jealousy, here, though rarely spoken, expanded in the quiet spaces of the room. The household around them contributed to this unease. Servants noticed fragments of conversations, glanced at passing expressions, and filled the rest with speculation. Their whispers shaped the environment, sometimes unintentionally, sometimes deliberately. A misplaced comment could ignite suspicion. An overheard laugh could cause hurt. A single wrong word could be repeated in another corner of the house until it reached ears eager to interpret it. The couple found themselves navigating a world where even shadows seemed capable of carrying messages. Within the chamber, jealousy expressed itself through small, restrained gestures. A wife might adjust her posture to appear composed when she felt anything but. A husband might avoid certain topics to prevent conflict. Their restraint became habitual, built into their nightly routines, creating a fragile balance that felt as though it might break beneath the slightest pressure. The bed, meant to unite them, became the line between their fears. Over time, jealousy shaped their perception of each other. A glance or a hesitation could take on meanings neither intended. They studied each other with a scrutiny that mirrored the world outside, turning their private moments into quiet calculations. The chamber absorbed these unspoken judgments, the way it absorbed everything else. The longer they lived within this system, the more natural jealousy seemed, as if it were an expected part of the marriage, rather than a symptom of insecurity. What made this form of jealousy so corrosive was its subtlety. It did not erupt like anger or fade like longing. It lived in the spaces between their breaths, in the pauses that followed unfinished sentences. It grew quietly, shaping the marriage not through confrontation, but through the pressure each spouse carried alone. They rarely addressed it directly because acknowledging it meant acknowledging their vulnerability, a risk neither felt safe enough to take. By the time jealousy had fully settled into the chamber, it felt less like an emotion and more like a condition of their lives. It shaped how they spoke, how they moved, and how they viewed their future. Even moments that should have brought closeness were marked by the tension of comparison and the fear of being outmatched by unseen rivals. Jealousy became a quiet force that shaped the rhythm of their nights. The tension that gathered between them had little to do with affection, and everything to do with the fragile roles they fought to protect. The chamber drew this unease deeper with each passing evening, narrowing the space where trust might have existed. Growing unrest beneath that narrowing space would soon reveal how silence became a weapon within their marriage. A Tudor wife often entered marriage, knowing that her husband's affections and his attentions might not belong solely to her. Mistresses were tolerated, sometimes even expected, especially among men whose status allowed them the freedom to pursue pleasure without consequence. The household accepted this imbalance quietly, shaping itself around the presence of women who stood outside the marriage, yet occupied space within the home. For the wife, this reality settled with a heaviness she could not voice. She learned early that her disapproval carried no weight. Still, the mistress rarely arrived with ceremony. She appeared gradually, through lingering glances, extended visits, or whispers exchanged between servants. Soon, her presence became part of the household's daily rhythm. She might sit near the hearth while the wife passed through the room, or share quiet conversations with the husband that seemed too familiar. The walls of the house absorbed this arrangement, transforming it from scandal into routine. A wife watching from a distance understood that the boundaries of her marriage were far more porous than she had ever been told. Her inability to object deepened the wound. Any sign of displeasure risked being interpreted as jealousy, weakness, or disobedience. If she protested openly, she risked damaging her position within the household. If she remained silent, she carried the burden alone. Silence became the safer option. Though it tightened around her like a cord drawn gradually closer, she learned to hold her expression steady, to walk past the mistress without hesitation, and to perform her duties as if the intrusion did not pierce her composure. Servants observed everything. They knew which rooms the husband visited, how long he stayed, and who accompanied him. Their whispers shaped the atmosphere of the household long before the wife learned to navigate it. A mistress who seemed favoured would receive softer smiles, quicker service, or more attention than the wife herself. These small shifts in behaviour revealed the changing hierarchy within the home. The wife, though still the legal centre of the marriage, he felt her influence thinning in corners she could not reach. What made the situation unbearable was the expectation that she would endure it with grace. Her worth was tied to her ability to maintain dignity. Even as her authority eroded, she might lie awake in the chamber, hearing distant footsteps or muffled laughter, each sound a reminder that the marriage she had been promised was never truly hers to claim. Yet in the morning, she was expected to rise, carry out her duties, and present a composed face to the household. Her suffering remained invisible by necessity. The presence of a mistress also placed the wife in constant comparison. She studied the other woman indirectly, noting her manner, her posture, her clothing, and her interactions with the husband. Comparison turned into self-scrutiny. The wife questioned whether she lacked charm, warmth, or beauty, whether her failures in childbirth or temperament had opened the door to this intrusion. Such doubts seeped into her private thoughts until they shaped how she saw herself. The chamber, once a place of obligation, now doubled as a reminder of her perceived inadequacy. For the husband, the arrangement required little adjustment. Mistresses did not threaten his status, they enhanced it. They symbolized virility, confidence, and influence. While he maintained his public marriage for lineage and stability, he turned to his mistress for comfort or companionship. The imbalance of privilege allowed him to move freely between the two women, without considering the emotional toll his behavior exacted. The wife watched this dynamic unfold with a quiet resignation she could not afford to express. Over time, the wife developed strategies to survive. She learned to mask her reactions, to avoid situations that intensified her discomfort, and to occupy parts of the house where she could move without encountering the mistress. She found small moments of control in choosing when to speak, when to retreat, and when to remain still. These gestures, though subtle, offered her the sense of structure she desperately needed in a world designed to minimize her voice. Yet the emotional cost persisted. Each day required her to balance her duty against the sharp ache of witnessing her own replacement. She carried jealousy not as an explosion of passion, but as a quiet, constant pressure beneath her ribs. It shaped her breathing, her posture, and the weight of her steps. The chamber amplified these feelings each night, turning them into a silent accumulation that she learned to conceal even from herself. The mistress, aware or unaware of the wife's pain, often continued her role without fear of consequence. She might receive gifts, affection, or whispers of devotion. These gestures, though private, altered the household in ways that left the wife isolated. The marriage contract offered no protection, because the husband's rights overshadowed the wife's suffering. She remained bound to the role society had assigned her, even as that role diminished before her eyes. Compassion for herself became a luxury she could not afford. She survived through restraint, understanding that endurance was her only shield. The jealousy she felt, though justified, could not surface. It had to be folded inward, hidden beneath layers of quiet obedience. The chamber became the place where she learned the difference between feeling and expression, between pain and survival. The quiet endurance shaping her nights held less to do with affection than with the fear of losing what little ground she still possessed. The chamber drew this unease into every silence, tightening the fragile balance she struggled to maintain. Deepening strain beneath that silence would soon reveal how carefully she must navigate a world where her presence could be eclipsed at any moment. Silence in a Tudor marriage was rarely a sign of peace. It was a method of survival, shaped by the knowledge that words carried consequences far heavier than most wives dared to risk. A woman learned quickly that speaking her fears, her anger, or even her simple discomfort could place her in danger. Silence became the safest language available to her, a shield that concealed her inner life while protecting her from accusations she could never hope to defend against. The chamber, with its dim light and heavy curtains, became the place where this strategy took its strongest form. A wife understood that her silence preserved more than her dignity. It preserved her security. If she objected to her husband's behavior, his choices, his temper, or the presence of another woman, she risked being labeled disobedient. Disobedience was not merely a private matter, it threatened the delicate structure of the household. It could lead to punishment, disgrace, or even the erosion of her position. So she learned to speak carefully, and then to speak less, until silence felt like the only voice she could safely use. Within the chamber, silence served multiple purposes. It prevented conflict, shielded her from inquiry, and allowed her to navigate her husband's moods with caution. If he returned frustrated, she stayed quiet. If he questioned her loyalty or competence, she kept her gaze steady. Silence softened moments that might otherwise erupt into confrontation. It was interpreted as respect, obedience, and restraint, all qualities expected of a Tudor wife. To the outside world, it seemed natural. To her, it was a daily act of endurance. She also learned that silence protected her from accusations she could never fully refute. In a society where a wife's behavior was constantly observed, even the smallest word risked being twisted into something incriminating. A poorly timed comment could become evidence of impropriety. A hint of frustration could be framed as rebellion. Servants carried whispers from one corner of the house to another, and rumors could reach the husband long before the wife realized she had been overheard. Silence prevented her from leaving traces that others might use against her. This silence extended into her emotional life. The chamber became the place where she folded her feelings inward, hiding them behind a calm expression. Anger dissolved into stillness. Fear became steady breathing. Disappointment settled into quiet nights where she stared at the ceiling, unable to give voice to the resentment growing beneath her composure. The bed beside her, rather than offering comfort, reminded her that vulnerability was a luxury she could not afford to show. For the husband, her silence often appeared convenient. It preserved his authority, allowed him to act without question, and reinforced the dynamic that placed him at the center of the household. He rarely understood the cost of her restraint. Silence protected him from conflict, but concealed the erosion of her trust. The absence of argument did not mean the absence of pain. It meant the wife had learned that speaking her truth would bring consequences she was unwilling to bear. Over time, silence became a habit so deeply ingrained that even moments of safety could not loosen it. A wife might sit alone, knowing she could whisper her thoughts without being heard, yet find her voice refusing to rise. She had trained herself to remain quiet, not only in her marriage but within her own mind. The discipline shaped her posture, her expressions, and even her breathing. Silence became part of her identity, a quiet echo of the world that had demanded it from her. The household reinforced this strategy daily. Conversations around her avoided topics that mattered, leaving her with polite exchanges that revealed nothing. Servants spoke carefully in her presence, measuring their tone as she measured hers. Everyone understood that words carried weight, and that silence often preserved stability better than honesty. This unspoken agreement trapped the wife within a system that rewarded her for disappearing into quiet compliance. As the years passed, she realized that silence did not numb her emotions. It contained them. The more she hid, the more tightly her feelings pressed against the inner walls she had built. Her jealousy, fear, and resentment gathered quietly, waiting for moments when they would surge unexpectedly. The chamber absorbed these emotions the way it absorbed the secrets of every Tudor marriage, storing them in its shadows. What she could not say shaped the marriage as much as what she said. Silence guided her actions, influencing how she moved through the house, how she responded to her husband, and how she protected herself from danger. It became the thread that held her life together. However fragile the weave might be, the chamber remained the center of this strategy, the place where she controlled her expression because losing control meant losing something far greater. Her quiet endurance held the household together more firmly than any spoken promise. The chamber tightened its grip around her emotions, pressing them deeper into the silence she had learned to rely on. Growing strain beneath that muted exterior would soon reveal how closely caution and fear shaped every corner of her life. A Tudor wife lived within boundaries drawn around her body long before she understood their full meaning. Every aspect of her physical existence, her clothing, her movements, her pregnancies, was monitored with a level of scrutiny that left little room for autonomy. What she wore signaled obedience. How she carried herself signaled health. Whether she conceived signaled value. Her body ceased to belong to her the moment she married. It became a vessel for the dynasty, a physical extension of her husband's lineage and her family's aspirations. The chamber, where she might have hoped for privacy, became the center of this unyielding surveillance. Her clothing served as the first layer of control. The tight lacing of her bodice, the heavy fabric pressing against her ribs, and the structured shape of her gowns were not simply fashion choices. They were tools that shaped her posture and restricted her comfort. She was expected to appear composed at all times, even when the garments made breathing a deliberate effort. Any deviation from this expected presentation could be interpreted as negligence or disrespect. Servants and relatives watched her carefully, noting whether her attire reflected the dignity expected of her role. When pregnancy entered her life, the scrutiny intensified. Her appetite, her sleep, her complexion, and even the way she walked became subjects of observation. Women of the household offered advice that sounded gentle, but carried an undertone of pressure. Every gesture she made was considered evidence of success or failure. She could not rest freely, eat freely, or express discomfort without someone interpreting it as a sign of potential danger to the future heir. Her body became a site of constant evaluation, as if any small misstep might jeopardize more than her own well-being. Even childbirth, the most vulnerable moment of her life, was not hers to control. The room where she labored was filled with women whose presence was meant to assist but also to witness. They monitored her progress, her reactions, and her endurance, ensuring that the birth followed accepted customs. Her pain was not central to the experience. The continuation of the family line was, the moment the child was delivered, attention shifted immediately to whether it was a son, and her value adjusted accordingly. She was left to recover in silence, while others discussed the significance of the infant's arrival. Outside of pregnancy, her body remained under constant assessment. If she appeared too thin, too pale, or too fatigued, questions arose about her fitness to bear future children. If she appeared too lively or independent, accusations of impropriety could surface. Her physical presence had to strike a careful balance, visible enough to demonstrate health, restrained enough to avoid suspicion. She learned to shape her movements to meet expectations, even when exhaustion pressed heavily against her. The chamber reflected these dynamics most clearly. It served as the place where her husband exercised authority over her body, where witnesses confirmed consummation, and where pregnancies were watched closely. The bed itself symbolized the dynasty's claim on her. Each night, she entered the room, aware that her body was expected to fulfill duties she had not chosen. The quiet of the chamber offered no relief. It amplified the sense that she lived under constant observation. Even when the observers were absent, her husband rarely questioned the system that granted him such control. He believed it to be the natural order of things, shaped by tradition and reinforced by the expectations of his peers. His authority over her body was framed as responsibility rather than domination. Yet this responsibility allowed him to dictate her routines, her diet, and her access to rest. The imbalance settled into their relationship until it felt unchangeable, a quiet rule woven into every part of their shared life. Over time, the wife internalized the pressure. She measured her steps, her tone, her expressions, and her body's responses to the demands placed upon it. She learned to interpret her husband's moods quickly, adjusting her behavior to avoid displeasure. Her emotions became secondary to maintaining the fragile stability the household required. Even when she recognized the injustice of her situation, She found no safe way to resist it. Her body was the currency of the marriage, and she bore its cost alone. Her days grew defined by the quiet tension between what was demanded of her and what she could no longer claim as her own. The chamber deepened that tension, with every expectation pressed onto her body, narrowing the space where she might breathe freely. Rising pressure beneath that narrowing world would soon reveal how control could turn even the smallest moment into quiet danger. A Tudor wife moved through her days with the quiet understanding that her body was never considered her own. Every gesture she made, every change in her appearance, and every shift in her health became information others believed they had the right to interpret. Privacy did not exist for her. Not in the halls where servants watched her posture. Not in the corridors where relatives speculated about her condition. And not even in the chamber where she slept. The boundaries she might have wished to draw around herself dissolved the moment she married, replaced by expectations she could not refuse. Her mornings began under observation. Servants studied her expression for signs of fatigue, knowing they would be asked about her condition later. If her appetite changed, it became a topic of whispered discussion. If her skin appeared too pale or too flushed, someone would report it to a relative or to her husband. These details, trivial in another life, became pieces of evidence that determined how closely she would be monitored in the coming days. Her body became a public document that others felt entitled to read. The lack of privacy extended to her physical routines. If she rested too long, she was questioned. If she walked briskly, she was cautioned. If she requested moments alone, suspicion surfaced. Her desires, her comfort, and her fatigue mattered less than the image she was expected to maintain. Even the simple act of undressing, something that might have offered a moment of solitude, happened under watchful eyes. Whether those eyes belonged to servants assisting her or relatives waiting to assess her condition. Pregnancy intensified this intrusion. From the earliest signs, she became the subject of constant surveillance. Every change in her body, her breathing, her posture, her cravings, was examined and discussed. Women circled her with gentle voices and insistent hands, claiming concern while reinforcing control. She could not move freely, speak freely, or react freely. Her body existed as an object of anticipation, as if each of its changes announced something greater than her own well-being. But even outside pregnancy, the scrutiny persisted. If she gained weight, she faced quiet reprimands. If she lost it, she faced deeper worry. If she seemed anxious, speculative murmurs followed her through the house. Her emotions themselves became evidence of physical instability, and physical instability became a reason for closer oversight. She learned to compose her face into neutrality, protecting the parts of herself she could not express. In the chamber, her loss of ownership was most visible. The space meant for rest became the place where her body was claimed by expectation and duty. She entered the bed with the knowledge that her comfort was secondary to the responsibilities placed upon her. Her husband's authority, supported by law and tradition, allowed him to dictate her physical availability without needing her agreement. When relatives or witnesses were required to verify consummation, even this most personal moment became a public matter. Her body offered no refuge. It was the site of obligation, not intimacy. The pressure shaped how she moved through the world. She measured each step, each glance, each breath. She learned to silence discomfort, to hide pain, and to mask fear. These adjustments became part of her identity, transforming her into someone who lived inside a body she could not fully inhabit. The more she surrendered to these expectations, the more distant she became from herself. It was not rebellion she feared. It was the consequences of simply being seen as imperfect, uncooperative, or unproductive. Her husband rarely recognized the extent of her loss. He saw only the duties she performed, not the confinement within which she existed. His view of her was shaped by a system that considered her body a resource, something to protect, manage, and claim. He believed he was fulfilling his role by overseeing her well-being, never realizing that his presence deepened the sense of being possessed rather than cared for. In time, she understood that there was no space left untouched by surveillance. Whether she stood in the great hall, or knelt in prayer, or lay quietly in the chamber, she inhabited a body that belonged more to the dynasty than to herself. This realization settled into her nights, shaping the way she breathed in the dim light, the way she folded her hands in stillness, and the way she avoided letting her true emotions surface, even in solitude. Her days grew marked by the quiet understanding that control shaped every corner of her existence. The chamber pressed this truth deeper into her life, narrowing the boundary between duty and self until almost nothing remained solely hers. Shifting tension beneath that narrowing boundary would soon show how easily control could tighten into quiet peril. Violence within a Tudor marriage did not always appear as sudden outbursts or chaotic scenes. It often unfolded quietly, woven into the expectations of the household and tolerated under the guise of discipline. A husband's authority granted him the right to correct his wife, and the line between correction and cruelty was drawn not by her suffering, but by the judgment of those who claimed to understand a husband's responsibilities better than she did. The harm she endured, whether physical or emotional, was shaped by a system that viewed her body as something he was permitted to command. The normalization of violence made it difficult for the wife to name what was happening to her. When a husband struck his wife, relatives or servants might call it frustration, or guidance, or simply a moment of temper. They rarely acknowledged her pain. She learned quickly that seeking sympathy could be dangerous. Complaints might be framed as disobedience, and disobedience could lead to deeper punishment. Silence, once again, offered the only protection she could rely on. Within the chamber, violence took on its most concealed form. The walls absorbed the sounds that echoed through the night. An argument cut short. A sudden movement. A muffled sob. In the morning, the outside world saw only a composed wife moving carefully through her routines. The marks on her skin, if she could not hide them, were explained away as accidents. Servants were not to ask questions. Their silence preserved the household's reputation and kept them safely within their own roles. The husband, emboldened by custom and law, often viewed his actions as rightful expressions of authority. He believed he was maintaining order, correcting behavior, and fulfilling duties expected of him. When he grew angry, he blamed her tone, her hesitation, her perceived failures. His anger rarely startled him. It felt like a privilege he had inherited, one reinforced by the world around him. He could strike, shout, meet or restrain without fearing censure. His power was unquestioned, and that certainty fed the cycle. For the wife, what hurt was not only the violence itself, but the knowledge that her suffering existed in a space where no one felt compelled to intervene. She moved with caution, anticipating the shifts in her husband's mood before they surfaced. A tightened jaw, a prolonged silence, or a sharp inhale could signal danger. She learned to navigate these moments with small, deliberate gestures, lowering her gaze, softening her voice, adjusting her pace. These efforts rarely changed the outcome, yet they gave her a sense of control in a world where she had almost none. The emotional toll deepened with time. Each instance of violence left an imprint on her, shaping how she perceived the chamber, the household, and herself. She began to inhabit a body marked not only by physical pain, but by the constant expectation of more. Fear settled into her nights like a second shadow. Even when no harm came, the possibility felt close enough to touch. She slept lightly, listening for footsteps, waiting for silence to break. What made Tudor marital violence particularly devastating was the way it blurred into the rhythm of daily life. A wife could be handled roughly in the privacy of the chamber and then be expected to host guests gracefully hours later. Her outward composure created the illusion that everything was stable. No one questioned her forced smiles, her careful movements, or the way she avoided certain gestures. Her pain lived beneath her clothing, beneath her obligations, beneath the rules she followed without question. In some cases, the violence escalated gradually, becoming harsher as the household tightened its expectations. But in many others, it remained subtle, delivered through harsh grips, crushing silence, or restricted movement. These forms left fewer marks yet inflicted lasting harm. A wife, accustomed to such control, learned to anticipate it with the same precision she applied to every other part of her life. The chamber, dim and heavy, felt increasingly like a place where she needed to brace herself rather than rest. Over time, the violence reshaped how she viewed her marriage. She no longer expected tenderness. She expected consequences. Her world shrank to accommodate this reality. She avoided provoking him, avoided confiding in others, and avoiding acknowledging her own fear. Her restraint became a form of survival. Quiet, steady, unrecognized by those who assumed discipline was natural. Yet the chamber remembered what the household refused to see. It held the echoes of nights where she lay still, the weight of fear in her breath, and the moments when she swallowed her voice to protect herself. It hid the traces of harm that no one would speak of. The violence, though unrecorded, shaped the life she lived more deeply than any public duty. Her nights settled into a fragile rhythm, shaped by caution and the quiet hope of avoiding further harm. The chamber pressed this reality deeper into her days, narrowing the distance between fear and endurance. Growing strain beneath that constrained existence would soon reveal how suspicion could turn even a whisper into danger. A Tudor husband carried jealousy not as a passing feeling, but as a threat he believed could unravel his household. Suspicion settled easily in his mind because a wife's perceived infidelity reached far beyond private betrayal. It cast doubt on lineage, inheritance, and honor. Even the faintest whisper that she had been too familiar with another man could ignite a reaction that reshaped the entire rhythm of their marriage. He lived within a world that told him his reputation was fragile, and that a wife's loyalty determined the legitimacy of everything he hoped to pass on. Under such pressure, jealousy took root quickly. The rumors rarely needed substance. A servant's careless remark, a misinterpreted glance, or an unexplained delay could become evidence in his imagination. He replayed these moments silently, allowing doubt to expand until it overshadowed reason. His jealousy did not require proof. It required only the suggestion of danger. Once the idea took hold, he watched his wife with sharpened attention, searching for signs he believed he had overlooked. The weight of his own fears created meanings where none existed. His suspicion followed her into the chamber, where their private life turned into a realm of quiet interrogation. The questions he asked sounded simple. Where were you? Who spoke to you? What distracted you today? The tone behind them revealed their true purpose. They were not inquiries for clarity, they were tests. He listened closely to her replies, measuring her pauses, her breathing, her gaze. She learned quickly that even honesty could be misread, twisted into something incriminating if his mind had already decided she was hiding something. For the wife, this shift brought a new kind of fear. She moved carefully, knowing that anything she said or failed to say could deepen his suspicion. Her days grew shaped by the effort of predicting which behaviors might calm him and which might inflame him. She avoided speaking with certain men, avoiding lingering too long in shared spaces, avoided showing distress that he might interpret as guilt. Even routine tasks became potential hazards. She lived with the awareness that her safety depended on how convincingly she could navigate his jealousy. The household reinforced his vigilance. Servants, eager to please, or fearful of consequences, repeated fragments of conversations they overheard. Relatives offered warnings or advice that encouraged him to guard his honor more fiercely. These voices fed his insecurity, making him believe that danger lurked quietly within his own home. Instead of questioning the system that demanded such watchfulness, he adopted it willingly. It felt like protection, even as it reshaped his marriage into something strained and brittle. Within the chamber, the intensity of his suspicion felt unavoidable. Nights that should have offered rest became periods of tension. He watched her movements with quiet scrutiny. The way she lay down, the way she turned her head, the way her hands folded in stillness. Small gestures carried meanings she never intended. When she hesitated before speaking, he noted it. When she sighed without explanation, he questioned it. The chamber's silence magnified his thoughts, turning them back upon her with increasing pressure. What frightened her most was that jealousy required no conclusion. It did not fade simply because she explained herself. It lived as long as he believed it necessary to guard his name. The more she tried to reassure him, the more he wondered why reassurance was needed. His suspicion became a loop she could not break. Her calmness could appear calculated. Her distress could appear guilty. Her silence could appear strategic. No response truly protected her. As suspicion grew, so did the distance between them. He withdrew tenderness before she even realized it was gone. Conversations shortened. Expressions stiffened. The chamber, once merely a place of duty, became the site of quiet judgment. He did not need to raise his voice for her to feel the weight of his doubt. The air itself shifted, tightening around her like an invisible restraint. The emotional toll settled into her gradually. She felt herself shrinking, not from lack of confidence, but from the need to avoid provoking him. She became careful with her footsteps, careful with her breathing, careful with the way she lowered her gaze. His jealousy shaped her posture as surely as it shaped the rules of the household. She began to anticipate questions before he asked them, arranging her day around his fears rather than her own needs. This vigilance drained her, yet she maintained it because she understood the danger of letting it slip. Even when she believed he might finally release his suspicion, another rumor could surface and restart the cycle. Jealousy in a Tudor marriage did not disappear. It paused. It waited for the next perceived misstep, the next whispered comment, the next unplanned absence. She learned to live inside its shadow, adapting her behavior to survive rather than to be understood. His suspicions settled over their nights with a pressure that shaped her every movement more than affection ever had. The chamber deepened this unease, drawing each silence into sharper focus, until trust felt almost unreachable. Rising tension beneath that strained quiet would soon show how easily fear could harden into accusation. Accusations of infidelity carried a weight in Tudor life that stretched far beyond the chamber. A wife understood that suspicion did not end with her husband's anger. It could reach the court, the council, and even the crown. Betraying a marriage was seen as betraying a dynasty, and betraying a dynasty veered dangerously close to betraying the realm. The line between private misconduct and political threat was so thin that a misplaced glance, a misunderstood gesture, or an unfortunate moment of vulnerability could pull her into consequences she could not escape. The fear of being accused shaped her days as quietly and relentlessly as the expectations placed upon her body. Even when she had done nothing wrong, the atmosphere of the household made guilt feel dangerously close. She moved through corridors, aware that her steps were watched, that her conversations were overheard, and that her silences could be interpreted in more ways than she intended. Servants carried stories with them, like threads that wove into larger narratives. A sumplact, pausing to thank a male servant, receiving a message from a cousin, or standing too close to an open doorway, could be recast into something dangerous. She felt the fragility of her security each time a whisper drifted behind her. Her husband's jealousy made the threat even sharper. When suspicion clouded his judgment, he looked for patterns that confirmed what he feared. She felt this pressure whenever she entered the chamber. The room grew heavy with his watchfulness, and she learned to anticipate the questions that came before he asked them. Where were you? Who spoke to you? Why did you look away so quickly? Each answer she gave risked sounding defensive, and each hesitation risked sounding guilty. She learned to hold her voice steady, even when her breath trembled. Outside the home, the danger multiplied. The Tudor court thrived on rumour, and those who wished to damage a family needed only to suggest impropriety. A wife accused of adultery did not merely face disgrace, because her loyalty was tied to the purity of lineage. A charge of betrayal implied that her children, future heirs, might not belong to the bloodline at all. Such doubt threatened property, titles, and political alliances. A small spark of suspicion could ignite reactions that stretched far beyond her marriage. She knew that even innocence offered little protection once rumour became a weapon. Within the chamber, the fear manifested in her posture. She moved carefully, avoiding sudden gestures or signs of distress. She kept her tone low, her words precise, and her expression calm. She understood that the chamber witnessed everything, and that anything which happened within it could be interpreted differently once carried into daylight. The bed, which should have offered rest, became the place where she rehearsed the explanations she might need one day. Her mind worked constantly to protect herself from accusations she had not yet heard. As suspicion hovered, she became increasingly isolated. Confiding in another woman risked misinterpretation, and confiding in a man was unthinkable. She held her fears alone, allowing them to settle into her body until they coloured each breath. She watched her husband closely, searching for signs that his trust was slipping further. The tension between them grew not from conflict, but from the slow erosion of certainty. She felt herself shrinking from the world, not out of guilt, but out of the terror that guilt could be assigned to her without proof. The consequences of the accusation were too well known. Wives of noblemen, queens themselves, had faced imprisonment, public humiliation, or execution under charges rooted more in politics than truth. These stories lingered in her mind as warnings. She lived aware that accusations required no evidence, only convenience. A husband who needed justification for replacing her could find it easily. A rival family could plant the seeds of suspicion. A political shift could turn her marriage into leverage. Her vulnerability was not situational, it was structural. Even in moments when her husband seemed satisfied, she felt the risk beneath the calm. Suspicion, once introduced, could reappear without warning. She learned to carry herself with measured restraint, presenting a version of herself that felt safe but hollow. The cost of maintaining this constant vigilance drained her, but she understood the alternative was far more dangerous. Her life depended on the absence of doubt, and doubt was something she could not fully control. Night after night, the chamber absorbed this fear. Its silence held the weight of her unspoken thoughts, the prayers that her husband would not be moved by rumour, the dread that one misinterpreted gesture could end her future, the knowledge that she existed within a system where innocence offered no shield. She fell asleep knowing that her security depended not on her actions, but on the stories others chose to tell about her. Her fear settled into the quiet of each evening, shaping her movements more tightly than any duty she had been taught. The chamber pressed this vulnerability deeper into her nights, narrowing the margin between innocence and accusation. Growing unease beneath that fragile calm would soon reveal how easily a whispered rumour could turn the home into a place of quiet judgment. Rumour in Tudor life did not begin as a roar. It began as a breath, soft, uncertain, drifting lightly through corridors before it settled with the weight of a verdict. A wife quickly learned how little stood between her daily routine and the danger of being named. A single whispered remark, carried by a servant passing through a dim hallway, or exchange between relatives near a shuttered window, could outgrow its uncertain origin and transform into something sharp enough to pierce the stability of her marriage. Evidence mattered far less than repetition, and repetition mattered far less than convenience. Those who whispered rarely understood the consequences their words could bring. A casual observation, a glance held too long, a laugh interpreted poorly, a moment of proximity, mistaken for intimacy, could be reshaped by others into something far more damning. Once spoken, the words took on a life of their own. They travelled from one servant to another, from household to neighbour, from neighbour to court, gathering weight as they moved. By the time they reached the husband, they no longer resembled the fleeting moment that first inspired them. They had become a story. For the wife, these stories arrived without warning. She often sensed them before hearing them, felt them in the way her husband paused before speaking or the way servants avoided her gaze. The shift in atmosphere grew unmistakable, a quietness that followed her down staircases. Small hesitations in greetings, a faint tension beneath ordinary conversation. These signals were subtle yet impossible to ignore. She realized quickly that the threat did not lie in becoming guilty, it lay in being perceived as guilty. The chamber played a central role in this danger. It was the one place where she spent time in relative solitude, and solitude itself created suspicion. If she lingered there too long, someone wondered why. If she left too quickly, someone wondered where she was going. If she closed the door for warmth or for rest, someone speculated what she might be trying to hide. The bedroom, rather than shielding her from scrutiny, became the space where imaginations filled the silence with inventions, because no one could see what happened inside. They chose to believe whatever version of events served their interest. Her husband, hearing fragments of rumour, responded with an unease he rarely admitted. He asked fewer questions at first, listening instead to the tone of her voice, the steadiness of her movements, the calmness of her gaze. Every detail became evidence he weighed quietly. If he sensed contradiction or fear, he tightened his scrutiny. If he sensed composure, he wondered whether that composure was practiced. Rumour made him doubt the very foundation of his marriage, not because he wished to, but because the world around him insisted that vigilance was a virtue. To the wife, this shift felt like stepping into a chamber where the walls had grown closer overnight. She understood that claims of innocence mattered little against the power of a repeated whisper. A rumour could not be disproven. It could only be replaced by another rumour more useful to those who wished to shape her fate. Those who disliked her, envied her, or sought advantage could twist the smallest detail into a weapon sharp enough to wound her beyond repair. She lived with the realization that her reputation rested not on her actions, but on the interpretation of others. The greatest danger came from how swiftly rumour aligned with the expectations of Tudor society. A woman accused of impropriety was not merely suspected of personal failure. She was suspected of undermining her husband's authority, endangering lineage, and threatening the stability of alliances. Her body, on her silence, and her daily routines became pieces in a narrative she could not control. The more she tried to appear calm, the more some believed she hid something. The more she tried to explain, the more others believed she protested too much. What made rumours so deadly was their persistence. Even when disproven, even when forgotten, they left traces, lingering doubts that returned whenever tension resurfaced. A husband who once dismissed a rumour might recall it months or years later, using it as justification for deeper suspicion. The wife carried these echoes with her, knowing that innocence offered no lasting protection. The chamber heard every quiet moment shaped by this fear. It heard her steady breathing as she lay awake, rehearsing answers to questions not yet asked. It heard her careful footsteps as she moved to avoid waking her husband when his mood seemed dangerous. It absorbed her dread, her restraint, and the fragile hope that no new whisper would drift into their lives. The chamber, meant to be a place of intimacy, became the birthplace of the very suspicions that threatened her future. Rumour settled into her life with a force she could not challenge, shaping her movements more tightly than any rule she had been taught. The chamber drew this fear deeper into her nights, narrowing her sense of safety to almost nothing. Quiet pressure beneath that fear would soon show how fragile survival became when judgment hovered just beyond the door. Life for a Tudor wife settled into a pattern shaped by constant observation. She understood early that every moment required careful attention, that each step she took and each breath she released might be interpreted by someone who believed they understood her better than she understood herself. Her world became a landscape where caution guided every movement, pressing her into a state of vigilance that reached far beyond simple awareness. It became a form of survival she carried quietly through each hour of the day. Her attention sharpened first around language. Before answering even the simplest question, she measured her tone, considered what others might infer, and prepared herself for any suspicion her words could provoke. She avoided allowing emotion to colour her speech because emotion could be misread, repeated, or used as evidence of instability. She shortened her replies, shaped them with precision, and allowed silence to carry what she dared not say. Speaking freely no longer felt safe. It felt reckless. And recklessness had no place in the environment she inhabited. Her movements soon followed the same discipline. She controlled her posture, her gestures, and her expressions with deliberate restraint. A lifted glance might be seen as impertinent. A lowered one might be interpreted as secrecy. A moment of hesitation could spark speculation. She learned to keep her body still, letting her hands rest calmly, letting her steps remain quiet and measured. Those around her rarely recognized the effort required to maintain this poise. What appeared natural to them felt like a daily negotiation with danger to her. Emotion became the most tightly guarded part of her life. She understood that revealing fear or sorrow invited questions she could not safely answer. Anger was even more treacherous. Even private frustration felt unsafe to express. Because privacy itself was uncertain, she kept her face controlled, smoothing over moments of distress until they left no visible trace. Even in the rare moments when she felt the pull of relief or affection, she caught herself before the feeling surfaced. Emotion had become something she managed, not something she lived. The chamber offered no shelter from this vigilance. When she crossed its threshold at night, the dimness did not relax her. It reminded her how closely she was observed, even when no one else was present. The bed, instead of being a place of comfort, became the center of her quiet tension. She lay awake, rehearsing the events of the day, searching for anything she might have done that could provoke suspicion. Her mind catalogued each expression, each word, each movement. Rest came only in light fragments, interrupted by the smallest sound or shift in the atmosphere of the room. Her husband's presence intensified this alertness. She read his mood the way others read written letters, tracing small indications, the way he closed a door, the rhythm of his breathing, the silence before he spoke. These small observations guided her responses. She adjusted her pace when he appeared frustrated, lowered her gaze when he carried doubt, and maintained a calm, unaffected tone whenever he seemed uncertain. Trust had eroded long ago, replaced by her effort to avoid provoking accusation or anger. She remained near him, but never felt safe beside him. Suspicion from others in the household deepened her need for caution. Servants watched her as they passed through corridors, their glances lasting slightly too long. Relatives asked questions that sounded polite, but carried undertones she recognized. Visitors seemed to study her without appearing to do so. Each person became a potential witness who might misunderstand her actions or misrepresent her intentions. The more she felt observed, the more she retreated into quiet vigilance. The isolation that resulted grew gradually, settling into her mind until it felt permanent. She could not confide in other women because their loyalty could shift under pressure. She could not confide in her family, because their advice might expose her further. She could not confide in servants, because their words travelled quickly. She held her fears alone, storing them carefully within herself to keep them from being discovered. Isolation became both her shield and her burden. Living in this constant alertness reshaped how she understood herself. She remembered a time when she moved through life without such restraint, when her thoughts did not require defense, and when her feelings did not threaten her position. That version of herself grew distant. She no longer recognized the ease she once felt, nor the confidence she once carried. Instead, she existed in a life where each moment required vigilance, where safety depended on her ability to anticipate danger before it appeared. The chamber captured every trace of this transformation. It held the tension in her shoulders as she prepared for the night. It held the quiet breaths she released when she woke before dawn, knowing she had slept too lightly again. It recorded the muted pace of her steps as she moved within it, careful not to disturb the delicate balance she maintained. The room had become the heart of her vigilance, shaping her understanding of herself and the world she lived in. Her days narrowed into a fragile balance, held together by caution more than comfort. The chamber drew this vigilance deeper into her nights, pressing each restrained breath into the silence surrounding her. Quiet strain beneath that constant alertness would soon reveal how fully isolation had carved itself into her life. Loneliness in a Tudor marriage did not arrive suddenly. It settled slowly, shaping itself around the wife as she moved through the rhythms of daily life, until the presence of her husband no longer offered connection but reminded her of the distance between them. She lived beside him, shared the same rooms, followed the same routines, yet felt separated by a boundary drawn not by space but by power. Her position required obedience, restraint, and silence, none of which allowed companionship to grow. What remained was a quiet isolation she carried through each hour without acknowledgement. The household itself deepened this sense of separation. Servants watched her from a distance, respectful but unreachable. They were bound to her husband, not to her, and their loyalty lay in maintaining the structure of the home rather than easing her solitude. She moved through hallways filled with people, yet felt no closer to them than to shadows passing in dim light. Each interaction carried formality instead of comfort. The politeness she received only emphasized how little she was understood within the place she was meant to call home. Her husband's presence created its own form of distance. His authority overshadowed their proximity, shaping every moment she spent near him. She responded to his questions with care, adjusted her behavior to match his expectations, and controlled her reactions to preserve peace. These habits prevented intimacy from forming. She could not share her thoughts without fear of misinterpretation. She could not reveal uncertainty without risking accusation. She lived in a world where emotional closeness felt dangerous, and the marriage became something she occupied rather than experienced. The chamber magnified this isolation. At night, she lay beside a man whose presence should have offered warmth. Yet she felt the space between them like an unspoken reminder of the roles they filled. The bed, placed at the center of their shared life, carried obligations that left little room for tenderness. She could not speak freely there, could not rest without caution, could not let her guard down even in the dimness. The chamber became less a place of rest and more a place where she confronted the full weight of her solitude. Her emotions had nowhere to go. Friends from girlhood had been left behind when she married, replaced by the expectations of her husband's family. Any attempt to build new connections risked misinterpretation. If she grew too close to another woman in the household, someone might accuse her of seeking alliances. If she grew too comfortable around a man, suspicion could flare. Her safest option was distance. She understood this. Yet the cost of that safety shaped her internal life in ways no one saw. Over time, she learned to divide herself into two versions, the one she presented to the world and the one she kept hidden. The outward version remained composed, obedient, controlled. The inward version felt the ache of loneliness pressing deeper with each passing year. She carried these feelings quietly, knowing that expressing them would offer no relief. The marriage demanded endurance, not understanding. Even moments of calm did little to soften the distance. She never entirely relaxed, even when her husband seemed satisfied, or the household fell silent. Isolation became a structure she lived within. It dictated how she stood, how she spoke, how she breathed. Without allies, she had no one to reflect her fears to, no one to help her interpret her husband's moods, no one to reassure her that the life she lived was difficult through no fault of her own. She bore this burden alone, shaping herself into someone who endured rather than someone who belonged. What made her isolation most profound was its invisibility. Her husband rarely sensed it. To him, the marriage functioned as expected. The household operated smoothly. Routines remained intact, and no open conflict disturbed the rhythm of their lives. He interpreted her quietness as dutiful steadiness, unaware that it concealed the absence of connection. Isolation left no marks on the skin, carried no sound, and left no trace that concerned those around her. It was a silence folded into her daily existence. The longer she lived within this structure, the more distant her past self became. Moments of ease she once experienced faded into memory. She no longer recalled the feeling of being understood or the comfort of speaking without fear. Instead, she knew only the stillness required to maintain her position. The chamber reflected this transformation each night, holding the quiet weight of her unspoken thoughts and the tension of a life lived in steady solitude. Her sense of identity thinned under this emotional distance. She performed the tasks expected of her, but they no longer felt connected to who she once was. Roles replaced relationships. Duty replaced companionship, and the marriage became a place she inhabited rather than shared. In time, isolation became the most consistent presence in her life. Her days settled into a quiet struggle, shaped more by distance than disagreement. The chamber held this loneliness close, pressing its silence deeper with each passing night. Tension rising beneath that growing emptiness would soon show how displacement could reshape every corner of her life. Replacement in a Tudor marriage did not arrive with a sudden announcement. It entered slowly, woven into the shifting expressions of the household, carried through cautious whispers, and confirmed by the quiet withdrawal of attention. A wife often sensed it before anyone spoke of it. The change appeared first in her husband's gaze, less lingering, less curious, less aware of her presence. Each passing day made the distance more pronounced, until she recognized that her position had begun to weaken in ways she could not repair. A marriage built on duty offered no protection once she ceased to meet the expectations tied to her role. Failure to bear a son marked the first point of vulnerability. Even if she produced daughters, even if she maintained her composure and fulfilled her responsibilities, the absence of a male heir shadowed her life. Relatives measured her worth by her ability to secure lineage. Servants noted her health with quiet judgment. Visitors looked at her stomach before they looked at her face. Each year that passed without a boy deepened the sense that her future no longer belonged to her. She understood that this failure, though beyond her control, could be used as justification to shift affection, attention, and power away from her. Falling out of favor often happened alongside this disappointment. Her husband, frustrated by uncertainty or influenced by those around him, gradually withdrew warmth. His voice grew more distant, his instructions more curt. Instead of seeking her company, he sought the presence of others. Women who seemed to hold his interest, families who offered alliances, or servants who kept him entertained. The wife observed this shift with steady silence. She recognized it not as a temporary frustration, but as a sign that her place in the household had begun to shrink. Suspicion, once planted, accelerated the process. A wife already under pressure could not afford even the faintest hint of impropriety. If her husband believed she concealed anything, fear, sadness, or resentment, he might interpret it as disloyalty. Rumors could reinforce these doubts, giving him reason to distance himself further. She lived with the knowledge that suspicion did not need justification. It needed only convenience. A husband seeking replacement could use it to frame his decision as necessary rather than cruel. The arrival of another woman, whether a mistress or a potential new wife, confirmed what she had feared. The household adjusted quickly, accommodating the newcomer with the warmth it had once offered her. Conversations shifted. Servants deferred. Even the daily rhythms of the home seemed to subtly rearrange themselves around the new presence. The one noticed details others believed she could ignore. The changed seating at meals. The lingering glances. The quiet deference shown to someone who had done nothing to earn it. She understood that the process of replacing her had already begun long before she saw the evidence. The chamber reflected this transition most clearly. Once the central space of her married life, it gradually became a room where her presence felt more like an obligation than a belonging. The air grew colder. The silences sharper. Nights once filled with tension now felt empty. Her husband's absence spoke more loudly than his anger ever had. Eventually, she might be moved to another room entirely. A quiet acknowledgement that the bed she once occupied no longer symbolized her place in the household. The chamber changed occupants, but the power structuring it remained untouched. What hurt most was that her disappearance caused little disturbance. The household continued as usual. Meals were served. Routines repeated. Doors opened and closed with the same steady rhythm. Her presence, once monitored so closely, now became invisible. Those who once watched her carefully shifted their attention elsewhere. She slipped from the center of the household to its edge without protest. Because protest offered no advantage, she carried herself with the same restraint she had learned throughout her marriage. Even as the ground beneath her shifted irreversibly, her identity thinned as her role dissolved. She had been taught that her value lay in her obedience, her composure, and her ability to secure the future of the family. When these expectations failed to protect her, she found little left to hold. She moved through the home with a silence deeper than before, shaped not by fear, but by resignation. She no longer attempted to interpret her husband's mood or anticipate his needs. Her presence no longer mattered to him, and this absence of significance became a burden she carried quietly. The power structure surrounding her never changed. The system that once demanded her obedience now justified her replacement. The expectations that once defined her role now defined her failure. She understood that the same rules would apply to the woman who followed her, and the woman after that. The chamber, the hierarchy, the pressure, they remained constant, indifferent to the lives they reshaped. Her days narrowed into a fading space, where her absence drew less notice than her presence once had. The chamber echoed this transition. Holding the weight of a role shifted to another without altering the power that governed it. Strain lingering beneath that quiet displacement would soon reveal how profoundly loss reshaped the rest of her life. Transitions within a Tudor household rarely appeared dramatic. They unfolded quietly, leaving behind only subtle traces of change that those living closest to the marriage recognized first. When a wife lost her position, the shift did not occur through an open declaration, but through the quiet rearranging of space, attention, and routine. The chamber absorbed these changes most clearly. One presence disappeared, another entered. Yet nothing in the room altered its function. It held the same expectations, the same authority, and the same unspoken rules that had shaped the life of the woman who came before. The former wife's absence settled into the structure of the home with startling ease. Her belongings were moved elsewhere, her duties reassigned, and her presence discussed less frequently until she became little more than part of the household's memory. Servants who had once observed her every gesture adjusted without hesitation. directing their loyalty toward the new figure placed at the center of the marriage. The roles remained unchanged, only the person fulfilling them shifted. The chamber, once filled with her quiet endurance, now welcomed another woman who stepped into the same narrow space she had occupied. The new wife entered the household with careful steps, guided by the expectations of those around her. She understood that the role she assumed had already been shaped by someone else's failures, suspicions, or misfortunes. The bed she approached each night was not merely furniture, it was the proof of her position, the symbol of what she was required to uphold, and the silent witness to what the previous wife had endured. The chamber's stillness offered no reassurance. It reminded her that she had inherited responsibilities that reached far beyond affection or choice. Her duties began immediately. She adjusted her posture, her tone, and her schedule to match the rhythm of the home. She learned the household's customs, sensed the expectations placed upon her, and adapted to the quiet scrutiny of servants who compared her with the woman she replaced. Her success depended not on her comfort, but on her ability to maintain the structure that had existed long before she arrived. The bed stood at the center of this structure, binding her to its rules with a weight she had little power to resist. The husband, unchanged by the transition, continued his routines as though nothing significant had shifted. His authority remained intact. His expectations remained absolute. He did not consider how easily the role of wife could be detached from the identity of the person who held it. To him, the marriage required function, not sentiment. The new wife's presence reaffirmed the household's stability, replacing what he believed had weakened or complicated the previous arrangement. He moved through the chamber with the same certainty he had always carried, indifferent to the unease that might have settled into the woman beside him. To the new wife, the chamber revealed its nature slowly. Its quietness pressed against her as she lay awake, realizing that each shadow, each silence, each night carried echoes of someone who had lived under the same expectations. The bed, unchanged, reminded her that the marriage demanded obedience, endurance, and quiet resilience. She could feel the structure shaping her, guiding her movements and limiting her choices. She understood that whatever affection or kindness she might hope for would not protect her if she failed to meet the standards the household required. The former wife's absence became a warning. The new wife recognized that her place in the chamber was secure only as long as she fulfilled her role without faltering. She studied the mistakes that had led to the previous woman's removal, carrying the lessons silently into her routines. The bed remained the measure of her success, the symbol of her legitimacy, and the reminder of how fragile her position could become if suspicion, disappointment, or rumor turned against her. She lived with the knowledge that the same quiet machinery that replaced the last wife could one day move against her. What remained constant was the structure of power surrounding the chamber. It did not soften for the new wife. It did not shift to accommodate her. The rules that governed her predecessor governed her just as tightly. She felt the distance created by hierarchy, the weight of expectation, and the quiet tension that shaped each night. The chamber did not change. It absorbed each woman's presence and released it without altering its purpose. The marriage, as defined by the household, existed independently of the individual occupying the role. Isolation settled quickly into this new arrangement. The new wife discovered that the chamber's significance lay not in intimacy, but in duty. It became the space where she negotiated her place in the household, managed her fears, and navigated the expectations placed upon her body and behavior. She understood that her survival depended on her ability to maintain stability, conceal emotion, and anticipate danger. In this space, the marriage continued without acknowledging the cost of those who lived within it. Her presence settled into the chamber with the same quiet strain that had shaped the life before hers, revealing how easily roles shifted even as structure remained unchanged. The room held this transition with steady indifference. pressing its expectations onto her without hesitation. Pressure rising beneath that unchanging rhythm would soon show how deeply endurance defined every woman who passed through its door. Long after the household had forgotten the struggles that shaped each night, the woman who lived within that chamber carried the weight of it in ways no one else could see. Fear settled into her slowly, shaping her reactions before she recognized how deeply it had taken hold. She learned to listen for shifts in tone, to measure the distance between words, and to anticipate displeasure before it appeared. The bedchamber, meant to offer warmth or rest, became the place where her nerves tightened the most. Its silence pressed against her, reminding her that the smallest misstep could invite suspicion or disappointment. This fear became a constant presence, guiding her movements as though she were navigating a landscape filled with hidden dangers. Jealousy followed closely behind. It did not rise from affection or longing, but from the fragile position she occupied. She understood how quickly replacement could occur, how easily rumors could reshape her place in the household, and how silently loyalty shifted around her. Each glance toward another woman, each whisper in a corridor, each change in the husband's mood carried the potential to threaten her stability. This awareness wore down her confidence. She felt herself tightening inward, watching others closely, analyzing every interaction for signs that her place might be weakening. The chamber amplified these fears. Its closeness forced her to confront them without escape, turning each night into a quiet test of endurance. Self-control became necessary for survival. She learned to hold back her reactions, to conceal frustration, to bury sadness before it rose to the surface. Every emotion required calculation. Her face, her voice, and her posture became tools she managed carefully, ensuring that nothing revealed vulnerability or defiance. Over time, the effort became instinctive. She no longer considered whether she wanted to express something. She simply prevented it. The chamber reinforced this discipline. Its stillness offered no refuge for raw emotion. Instead, it became the place where she refined the skill of presenting calm, even when her thoughts trembled beneath the surface. As seasons shifted around her, she began to sense a change within herself that she struggled to name. The person she once was, her preferences, her small joys, her inner rhythms, faded into the background. So much of her daily existence revolved around anticipation and caution that she rarely allowed herself to imagine life beyond these boundaries. The chamber, once simply a room, now represented the structure that shaped her identity. She moved through her days with careful steps, never fully relaxed, always attuned to the expectations surrounding her. Bit by bit, her sense of self thinned, replaced by the version required to survive the marriage. In moments of quiet reflection, she tried to remember what made her feel whole before she entered this household, before the chamber became a defining element of her life. Yet those memories blurred. She could recall them as images, but not as feelings. Fear had woven itself into her sense of stability. Jealousy had carved out space within her daily thoughts. Constant vigilance had become the framework through which she viewed the world. She adapted because the structure demanded it, not because she chose it. And the more she adapted, the less she recognized herself. The emotional toll extended beyond the confines of the bed. It seeped into her relationships with others, shaping how she approached conversations, how she interpreted gestures, and how she read silence. She found it difficult to trust easily, for trust had never been offered freely to her. She felt equally distant from those who served her and from those who held authority over her. Loneliness emerged not as an abrupt shift, but as a gradual settling of distance that grew heavier with time. Even when surrounded by people, she felt separated from them by expectations she could not cast aside. The chamber, intended to symbolize unity, offered her only tension. Nights spent within it reminded her that intimacy could be overshadowed by obligation, suspicion, or hierarchy. She could not approach its boundaries without recalling the gaze of those who monitored her, the weight of expectation from the household, or the unspoken rules that governed her behavior. Rest became elusive. Even sleep carried a sense of watchfulness. The room functioned less as a sanctuary and more as a reminder of the constant negotiation required to maintain her position. As the years passed, she realized the chamber's effects had shaped her in ways that might never fully fade. The instincts formed within those walls, caution, restraint, and self-suppression, followed her beyond the household, influencing how she behaved in other spaces. The marriage was only one part of her life, yet its impact lingered far longer than the night she spent in that bed. What remained was a quiet internal structure built from years of vigilance, a lasting imprint of the environment that had defined her sense of safety and identity. Her days settled into a rhythm molded by vigilance, leaving little room for the self she once carried quietly. The chamber held these changes firmly, shaping her responses until she could no longer distinguish between instinct and fear. Weight rising beneath that fragile balance would reveal how deeply the room's history marked every woman who lived beneath its rules. The traces left behind by Tudor marriages did not fade with the passing of the dynasty. They lingered quietly, settling into the customs and expectations that shaped families for centuries. What had once been a set of practices designed to protect lineage and property became woven into daily life, accepted without question. Anyone looking closely at these patterns would see how deeply they were rooted in hierarchy, and how many of those older ideas continued to influence relationships long after the Tudor court had vanished. The effects were not dramatic or sudden. They appeared in the way households were arranged, in the assumptions about obedience, and in the unspoken limits placed on women. These boundaries were treated as natural, even when they echoed decisions made in royal chambers hundreds of years earlier. The notion that a marriage was primarily a structure of authority persisted long after the era of monarchs who treated their spouses as political tools. Generations inherited these ideas without realizing their origins. Husbands took for granted that leadership flowed in one direction. Wives learned early that silence and endurance were essential traits. The dynamic was not always enforced with force. Often, it came through expectation, through the steady weight of tradition that made deviation feel like danger. Over time, the original political intentions of Tudor marriages blurred, but the shape of the relationship remained the same. Power rested with one person, responsibility with another, and both were told this was simply the way life was meant to be lived. The control once exercised over women's bodies also survived. It was softened, reshaped, and adapted to new moral codes. But the underlying principle remained familiar. A woman's worth was linked to her physical role in the family. Health, fertility, and appearance were still matters of scrutiny. Communities watched these details, forming judgments quietly, as though participating in a ritual older than they realized. While the monarchy no longer dictated lineage with the same intensity, the pressure for women to embody ideals they did not choose was still deeply felt. The echoes of earlier restrictions lingered in conversations. Advice and social expectations passed down through households. The bedroom continued to carry an imbalance of power. It was no longer guarded by servants or overshadowed by political alliances. Yet it remained a place where vulnerability and duty intersected uneasily. Emotional distance and unspoken fears often grew in that confined space. Couples lived within the residue of old expectations, performing roles shaped by history rather than personal choice. The room that should have been a place of rest still carried the weight of control and obligation. Many entered it without noticing how much of its atmosphere had been shaped by centuries of unequal relationships. This lingering structure influenced not only marriages but also the way society understood intimacy and authority. Decisions made by monarchs long ago continued to echo in ordinary households. The hierarchy established in Tudor times reinforced the idea that someone must lead and someone must yield. These assumptions seeped into customs, language, and even the smallest gestures between spouses. It was not always visible, yet it remained present, shaping lives quietly. The endurance of these ideas showed how deeply the past could root itself in the present, becoming part of habits that people rarely questioned. Over time, the consequences of these inherited roles became clearer. Women learned to carry their uncertainty inward, and men learned to measure stability through control. The imbalance created a pattern that was difficult to break, even when society changed around it. The Tudor world no longer existed, but its legacy persisted like a dim shadow that never fully loosened its hold. Many did not recognize the historical source of their constraints. They simply lived within boundaries shaped centuries earlier, unaware that their quiet struggles resembled those of women who had stood in candlelit chambers, waiting for judgments they could not escape. The endurance of structure kept old habits alive, allowing them to shape affection into something guarded and distant. That same weight slipped into households slowly, molding expectations long after the dynasty had ended. Beneath that stillness lay a deeper question about what truly remained once a marriage inherited centuries of uneven rules. When the bedroom no longer served as a place of rest, its meaning shifted into something far heavier. The Tudor world treated the chamber not as a sanctuary, but as a quiet arena where fear and expectation shaped every gesture. Anyone watching from a distance would see how the smallest movements, the faintest expressions, carried significance. A lowered gaze could be misread, a delayed response could be noted, and a whispered comment could be remembered long after it was spoken. In this space, the atmosphere thickened with unspoken rules, and the walls became witnesses to a marriage strained by scrutiny. What should have been a private refuge grew into an enclosed stage, where duty overshadowed comfort, and where each night brought its own quiet tension. Across many households of that era, the same pattern repeated. The marriage did not soften within those walls. Instead, it hardened, shaped by fear of missteps and by the constant awareness that affection mattered less than compliance. The ghost of authority remained present in every corner, settling between the couple like an unseen barrier. Even moments intended to be tender often carried a muted discomfort. The husband watched for loyalty. The wife watched for danger. And neither found ease in the presence of the other. They occupied the same room yet carried different burdens, each shaped by a world that valued control above comfort. Jealousy played its part in this shifting landscape. It did not emerge from affection, nor from any hope of closeness, but from uncertainty and fear. A husband who felt his authority threatened might observe his wife with a sharper eye, searching for signs that justified his suspicions. A wife who felt her position weakening might monitor every word, every movement, hoping to avoid a misunderstanding that could change her fate. Their interactions were guided not by trust, but by apprehension. The bedroom echoed with silence that said far more than words ever could. That silence grew thick, making the air feel heavier each passing night. Power lingered in the room as well. It took shape in the way decisions were made, in who was permitted to speak, and in who was allowed to rest without worry. The imbalance settled slowly into the couple's daily life. The husband felt protected by tradition, believing the structure was natural. The wife felt the weight of expectation pressing down, sometimes so deeply that she no longer recognized her own responses. Her life became a practice script, performed cautiously, shaped by the knowledge that one mistake could alter the course of her future. The chamber, intended for closeness, instead became a place where she learned to hold her breath. Those who lived within such marriages rarely recognized the transformation as it was happening. Change unfolded gradually, almost quietly. The tenderness a couple might have hoped for faded beneath obligation. Words that once carried warmth became simple instructions. Shared moments turned into routines, stripped of meaning. Over time, the room itself felt colder, its purpose reduced to maintaining order rather than offering rest. The wife learned to move carefully, to keep her posture calm, to maintain an appearance of composure even when fear ran quietly beneath her skin. Observers would have seen none of this. They would only have seen a household following expected customs, unaware of the strain beneath the surface. A deeper consequence emerged as the years passed. The chamber that should have offered protection instead drained those who lived inside it. The wife's identity grew thin. She became less of herself and more of what tradition required her to be. Her thoughts narrowed to what was safe to say, what was safe to feel, what was safe to hope for. The boundaries of the room seemed to shrink around her, leaving little space for the inner life she once carried. Even sleep felt distant. Resting in that bed meant surrendering to a silence that did not soothe, but watched, as though the room itself guarded a set of rules older than the marriage it contained. This unspoken tension did not erupt dramatically. It simply deepened with repetition. Each night built upon the previous one, forming a rhythm that shaped both husband and wife. The husband, assured by centuries of tradition, rarely questioned his role. The wife, shaped by vulnerability, rarely questioned her instinct to withdraw. The chamber became a muted battlefield, not of noise, but of quiet endurance. There were no cries, no declarations, no visible signs of conflict. Yet the weight of that conflict settled into every object in the room. The bed, the curtains, the floor, the closed door that rarely felt like protection. Some wives left the room eventually, though not by choice. Loss of favour, illness, or suspicion could remove them from the space they once called their own. Others remained until their spirit thinned to a faint echo of its former self. A small number endured without noticeable change, though endurance itself came at a cost. In each case, the room outlived them. It kept its role and its rules, waiting for the next couple who would step inside without realizing what the chamber demanded. The women who lived through these marriages rarely spoke about their experience. Silence protected them the same way it bound them. That silence, however, carried its own kind of ache. A witness standing quietly at the threshold would not see the battle directly. They would only sense it in the stillness, in the restrained gestures, in the careful breathing of those inside. They might wonder why the room felt so heavy, why the air held so much unspoken tension. They might not know that the lines of conflict were drawn not by swords or raised voices, but by fear, expectation, and centuries of tradition layered over one another. The bedroom, stripped of comfort, became a quiet landscape where the struggle for security and survival played out each night. This was the final shape of marriage, when rest no longer found its place. The walls held years of unspoken strain, shaped by jealousy and power, woven tightly together. Beneath that lingering stillness lay the truth that very few stepped out of such chambers with their inner selves entirely untouched. Thank you for listening to this long and heavy story. May your night be gentler than theirs ever was, and may your sleep come quietly, without the weight they carried. Good night, and rest well under calmer skies.